Hey guys, tonight we are going to lift the curtain of history and look directly into the personal tragedy of England's greatest woman, Queen Elizabeth Tudor. Let's begin with the scene that haunted her entire life. Picture this. A scream shatters the dead of night at the royal palace. Elizabeth Tudor bolts upright, sweat-soaked silk clinging to her, her crimson eyes staring into the darkness. She has just relived the 1,000th, the 10,000th time, that terrifying sight. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, kneeling on the scaffold. She screams, "Stop!" proclaiming herself queen, ordering the guards. But they do not hear. They cannot hear the voice of the 2-year-old child struggling in a panic. This is history's most cruel paradox. The woman who controlled the fate of an entire continent, the one whom empires feared, was completely helpless against a painful memory that occurred decades ago. How did a childhood trauma transform into a 45-year reign? And why couldn't the crown dispel the ghost that created it? Tonight, we will dive deep into the fear that forged Queen Elizabeth I. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening to this story from, and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Tudor wakes in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, her body trembling beneath the weight of another familiar nightmare. In the dream, her mother, Anne Boleyn, kneels on the straw-covered scaffold in the courtyard of the Tower of London. Elizabeth screams, her voice cracking with desperation. "Stop! I am the Queen! I command you to stop!" But the guards do not see her, do not hear her. The executioner raises his sword. The blade falls. Her mother's head rolls across the straw, the lips still parted as if to say goodbye. It is not merely a nightmare. It is a memory carved into her soul, a wound that bleeds every time she closes her eyes, a terror that has stalked her for 45 years, even though she is the most powerful woman in Europe. Why does the Queen of England tremble like a child in sleep? The answer lies in a single day, the 7th of September, 1533, the day Elizabeth was born. England rejoiced at the arrival of a princess. She was cradled in silk, wrapped in golden cloth, kissed by 100 courtiers bowing low. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, held her close and whispered, "You will be greater than any son." King Henry VIII, swollen with pride, called her the pearl of the world. For those first years, she was everything. The center of 2 kingdoms, her mother's heart and her father's throne. Anne taught her daughter to read before she could walk. By tracing letters on her tiny palm, she created a secret language between them, one only they understood. Elizabeth laughed when the courtiers bowed because her mother would write in her hand, "Their praise is nothing. I love you more." At 2 years old, the little girl could greet lords and ladies by name, her hair flaming red like her father, her eyes dark and sharp like her mother. Time seemed timeless, a perfect palace of gold, in which a girl would grow into a queen. But some paradises have sharp edges. When Anne miscarried a son, Henry's warmth evaporated. His eyes turned cold. He began to look elsewhere toward Jane Seymour, quiet and gentle. Everything Anne was not. And then, like the turn of a wind, death entered the palace. On the 19th of May, 1536, Elizabeth was alone in her nursery, stacking wooden blocks. She was 2 years old. Outside, 2 miles away, her mother knelt on the cold stone and prayed one last time. "God save the king. May he long reign over you." The French executioner lifted his sword, and the kingdom changed. Within hours, everything that marked Elizabeth as a princess vanished. Her silk gowns disappeared. Her golden cups were carried away. Her nursery was stripped bare. Servants, once full of deference, now spoke in whispers and avoided her gaze. She asked, "Where are my things going?" Her governess, Lady Bryan, could not answer. She asked, "When will Mama come back?" No one said a word. Parliament declared her a bastard. Her father, Henry, signed papers erasing her from the line of succession. The same father who once called her his pearl now acted as though she did not exist. The court called her Lady Elizabeth, not princess, not your grace, just a girl, a problem, a child they must house somewhere until she could be forgotten. Yet children understand more than adults think. Elizabeth remembered the silence more than the words. She remembered the way people stopped smiling. She remembered hearing the word witch whispered near her toys. She could not name her loss, but she felt it, deep as bone. She stopped asking where her mother was. Instead, she stayed quiet and listened. The wound formed that day never closed. It lived behind every smile, behind every ruby crown and golden throne. It was the wound of a child who learned too early that love could be taken, that safety was not promised, that even kings change their minds, that being loved does not mean being protected. And every night, as the candles in her palace flickered and the world drifted to sleep, the queen became the 2-year-old again, standing alone at the foot of the scaffold, watching the blade fall, helpless. Even as she ruled a kingdom, she dreamed of the one person she could not save. After her mother was executed, Elizabeth lost everything. The courtiers who once bowed deeply now avoided her gaze as though she carried some invisible illness. From "Your Grace," she became Lady Elizabeth, a title stripped of honour, rank, and blood. Her father, King Henry VIII, the man who once carried her through palace gardens and called her his pearl of the world, now could barely stand to look at her. When he was forced to, there was no warmth in his eyes, only disgust, as if her very existence reminded him of an unforgivable mistake. She was 4 years old when she first heard the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Witch, traitor, adulteress. They said her mother had bewitched Henry, seduced him with evil spells. They said Anne Boleyn had betrayed England itself. Elizabeth was too young to understand politics, but she was wise enough to listen. She learned that her mother had not died because she was evil, but because she had been unloved at the wrong moment by the wrong king. And so, Elizabeth learned her first lesson in survival: silence. She stopped asking for her mother. She stopped saying the word Papa. Instead, she paid attention. She listened to the tone of voices, watched how eyes shifted when her mother's name was mentioned. She learned to sit quietly while adults whispered, pretending not to hear while gathering the truth piece by piece. This skill, listening to what people did not say, would one day make her the most perceptive ruler in Europe. At the age of 4, she stopped being a princess and became a shadow. Elizabeth slept in servant rooms, ate with governesses, and was moved from one distant household to another like an unwanted bundle of clothing. Hatfield House, Hunsdon, Richmond. No one kept her long. It was easier to pass her on, to avoid the awkwardness of harbouring a child whom the king seemed to forget or despise. By the age of 10, Elizabeth spoke 4 languages fluently: English, Latin, French, and Italian. She read the works of Seneca and Plato by candlelight, her small hands tracing the letters like her mother once traced them on her palm. Scholars praised her genius. Courtiers ignored her presence. She was a bright flame hidden under thick cloth, visible only to those who bothered to look. But brilliance without power meant nothing. The law still called her illegitimate. The court still saw her as the daughter of a disgraced queen. No amount of intelligence could change the fact that she slept under a roof belonging to someone else, in a bed too small, with no promise of tomorrow. And yet Elizabeth did not wither. She did not become bitter or broken. She grew roots in the soil of neglect. Every slight became a lesson. Every silence became a seed of resolve. She observed how people bowed to power, not to truth. She noted how safety belonged only to those who owned their position, not those who inherited it. She understood even then that one day knowledge would be her only armor, her only weapon. She was a child, but she knew something adults rarely learn. It is not enough to be rightful. One must be prepared. There was no loving hand to guide her, no gentle embrace waiting in her chambers. But in those long, lonely years in borrowed rooms, she learned 2 things that would save her life. First, love could not be relied upon. Second, understanding could. Her father's rejection taught her the first. Her mind sharp, restless, hungry taught her the second. And she held both truths close to her heart as she waited in silence for her place in the world. Years later, when death and politics closed in on her, it was not beauty or birthright that would protect her, but the silent wisdom she carried since childhood, like a hidden blade in her sleeve. She learned to endure, and more importantly, she learned how to survive. In the year 1543, Parliament passed the Third Succession Act, restoring Elizabeth to the line of inheritance, though she remained officially illegitimate. She would stand third in line, behind her half-brother Edward and her half-sister Mary. It was a victory on parchment, thanks to the quiet influence of Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of King Henry VIII. Yet, even with her name restored to the royal order, Elizabeth was still the child marked by disgrace, the daughter of the executed queen. When Henry died on the 28th of January 1547, Elizabeth was only 14 years old. She had been fatherless in spirit for years, but now she was fatherless in fact. The court went into mourning. Bells tolled across London. Yet in Hatfield House, where Elizabeth lived, there were no tears. She had long learned how to keep grief behind her ribs, hidden like contraband. But something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. Kindness. Queen Catherine Parr took Elizabeth into her household. For the first time since Anne Boleyn's death, the girl felt the warmth of something like family. Catherine was gentle, scholarly, devout. She encouraged Elizabeth to continue her studies, to immerse herself in languages and scripture and music. Elizabeth began to trust her, even to admire her, a dangerous thing for a girl who had spent her whole childhood surviving without affection. But peace in the Tudor dynasty never lasts. In April of that same year, Catherine Parr married Thomas Seymour, the handsome and ambitious brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour. He was the Lord High Admiral, a man with powerful connections, roguish charm, and a hunger that no title could satisfy. Not long after marrying Catherine, he set his sights on something, or rather, someone else, the 14-year-old Elizabeth. It began subtly. He would enter Elizabeth's bedchamber at dawn, unannounced and uninvited, claiming it was a harmless joke. He wore only a nightshirt, barefoot, laughing, calling her Little Bess, as he tickled her and held her down by the shoulders. Then came the scissors. He cut the black silk of her gown while she wore it, slashing through the fabric as she squirmed. Elizabeth tried to make light of it, tried to laugh, but her body trembled after he left. Thomas Seymour's hands lingered where they should not. He called it teasing. Elizabeth called it nothing at all. That was the second lesson she learned. Unspeakable things are often hidden behind polite smiles. When Catherine discovered her husband's behaviour, the world seemed to still for one heartbeat. Surely, Elizabeth thought, here was a woman who understood suffering, a woman betrayed by her own king, now a queen herself, who had shown Elizabeth the first kindness she had known in years. Surely she would protect her. But Catherine Parr did not protect Elizabeth. She protected Thomas Seymour. A scandal would ruin them. Rumours were already spreading. So Catherine sent Elizabeth away. Not because she was guilty, but because she was vulnerable. And so Elizabeth learned her second survival lesson, carved deeper than the first. Even those who love you will choose themselves over you. She left Catherine's house silently, carrying her few belongings and her shattered trust. She said nothing. Not about the hands, not about the fear, not about the betrayal. She began to build something inside herself, a wall. Not the cold cruelty of neglect she had known as a child, but an inner fortress. A place where no hand could reach, no voice could command, no love could bury its blade and then call it fate. From that day forward she vowed that no man would ever hold power over her body or her destiny. She would not be used, thrown aside, or sacrificed for someone else's reputation again. She learned to smile politely, to speak softly, but never to yield herself. Years later, court historians would call her the Virgin Queen. They would speak of chastity as virtue, or policy, or myth. But the truth lay in that dark hallway, in 1547, when a girl learned no one, not even mothers, could always be trusted to stand between her and harm. And so Elizabeth made the only decision that made sense to her wounded heart. She would belong to no one. She would marry no one. She would love no one more than her own safety. For she now knew deep in her bones that unconditional love was a story told to children. And she was no longer a child. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was Elizabeth's half-sister, but their relationship had been poisoned long before either of them ascended the throne. Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn, was the living reminder of everything Mary had lost. When Henry VIII annulled his marriage to Catherine and married Anne, Mary was stripped of her title, her legitimacy, and her mother's place. She watched as Anne Boleyn was crowned in her mother's stead. She watched Elizabeth named princess while she herself was cast aside. A wound formed then, sharp, deep and quiet. It never healed. So when Mary Tudor finally claimed the crown in the year 1553, Elizabeth's fate trembled like a candle in a draught. A queen now ruled England, who had every reason to see her sister not as blood, but as threat. Elizabeth, with her youth, her intelligence, her Protestant sympathies, and her mother's stormy legacy, became more than just a rival. She became a symbol. A reminder. A prophecy Mary was determined to stop. In the early months of the year 1554, Thomas Wyatt the Younger led a rebellion against Queen Mary. It failed. There was no proof that Elizabeth had been involved. There were no letters bearing her signature, no whispers recorded from her lips. But evidence has never mattered to those who seek revenge, especially in the Tudor court. On the 17th of March, Elizabeth was pulled from her bed at Whitehall Palace. Soldiers surrounded her. They marched her toward the Tower of London, the same route her mother had taken 18 years earlier. She crossed the threshold of Traitor's Gate, stepped onto cold stones, slick with river water, and entered history's cruelest repetition. They locked her in the same royal apartments where Anne Boleyn had awaited execution. Through the window, Elizabeth could see the patch of earth green and quiet where her mother's blood had once darkened the ground. She was 20 years old. It was the middle of Lent. Outside, the bells tolled every morning to mark the hours. Inside, Elizabeth stared at the door every time footsteps passed, wondering if this was the day her life would end. She found a diamond ring on her finger and used it to scratch words into the wall. Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be. For 2 months, every sunrise held the possibility of death. Every creak of the iron lock sent a chill down her spine. But this time, unlike her mother, she did not scream. She did not plead. She did not cry. Elizabeth stayed silent, but not passive. She studied every move Mary made. She watched how the Queen's rage grew louder when challenged, how her paranoia flared when she sensed defiance. Elizabeth realized that to survive, she must give Mary what Anne never gave Henry: submission, or at least the appearance of it. She wrote letters soft, apologetic, perfectly crafted. She called Mary Your Majesty, addressed her as sister, swore her loyalty. She walked, quietly and obediently, to Catholic Mass. She crossed herself. She knelt. With every gesture, every calculated word, she signaled, I am no threat. And Mary, despite her hatred, wanted to believe it. On the 19th of May, exactly 18 years after Anne Boleyn died, Elizabeth was released under house arrest at Woodstock. She was pale, exhausted, changed. But she was alive. This was her second survival lesson. When the world wants to destroy you, sometimes the only way to stay alive is to bend, to bow, to let them think you are harmless until you can rise again. She had learned what her mother did not live long enough to teach her. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And because she whispered at the right moment, Elizabeth lived long enough to one day claim her own crown. In the year 1558, Queen Mary I, broken in body and spirit, succumbed to illness and died at the age of 42. Outside the grey walls of Hatfield House, the air was cold and still. A lone rider galloped into the courtyard, dismounted, and fell to his knees. His voice trembled only slightly as he uttered words that changed the course of history. Your Majesty. Elizabeth did not answer at first. She simply bowed her head as if acknowledging a fate she had always known would come. A child once exiled to servants' chambers, a young woman once called bastard by Parliament, now stood as the sovereign ruler of England. And yet, even as the title of Queen settled on her shoulders, she could feel the cold breath of memory upon her neck, the whisper of a blade descending on straw. On the 15th of January 1559, Elizabeth Tudor was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. There were banners and trumpets and chants rising like prayers. That day, the same lords who once ignored her, the same crowd who once whispered, "Bastard," shouted instead, "Long live the Queen," a great tapestry of paradox. A nation rejoicing, yet beneath their approval lay cold ink on parliamentary paper that still declared her illegitimate. Elizabeth knew better than to trust the throne beneath her. She knew power was not inherited safely, it was built, defended, and held by those who understood its rules. She would not be like her mother. She would not die for love or naivete. She would rule with her mind. Within months, she pushed her first great work through Parliament, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. She, and not the Pope, was the supreme governor of the Church of England. She restored Protestant worship while allowing certain Catholic traditions a fragile but brilliant balance. It was not a declaration of faith as much as a declaration of control. Faith, like power, was something Elizabeth tailored to fit her needs. She then set about building something England had never seen before: a unified, modern, centralized monarchy that listened, learned, and adapted. She read every dispatch that reached her desk, studied every foreign threat, and played European kings against one another like chess pieces. She never underestimated them, and she never forgot how quickly a crown could topple. She insisted on personally approving every major state decision. She chose her councillors carefully, then held them on invisible strings. Her greatest test came nearly 30 years into her reign. In the year 1588, Spain, under King Philip II, sent 130 warships to invade England. The Spanish Armada was the greatest naval force Europe had ever seen an empire's fist raised toward the island queen who refused to marry its king. In August, at Tilbury, Elizabeth rode out to face her troops. Dressed in white armour atop a warhorse, she was a vision both saintly and fierce. Before her soldiers, she spoke words that would echo through time. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This was not just a speech, it was a vow. A promise made not only to her troops but to the ghost of the child. She had once been the child who watched her mother die and could do nothing. Now she commanded armies. Now she sent fleets into the Channel to burn the ships of the empire that meant to break her. The Armada failed. Violent storms and relentless English firepower shattered Spanish pride. Elizabeth did not celebrate loudly. She merely stood beneath the grey sky, closed her eyes, and breathed out as if releasing one more chain from around her chest. She had saved England. She had turned a vulnerable kingdom into a burgeoning empire. Her people called her Good Queen Bess. The poets wrote of a golden age bearing her name. And yet, when night fell, when torches were dimmed and servants had gone, Elizabeth would once again lie awake, staring into the flickering candlelight, watching the blade in her mind come down again and again. A crown on her head, but inside, she was still the child at the foot of the scaffold, hearing her own voice cry out, "I command you to stop," and the sword never did. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne, Europe trembled. A woman long branded as a bastard now sat on the throne of England. Ambassadors whispered across marble halls. Kings scoffed. Popes frowned. Monarchs from France to Spain and Scotland watched her every move, waiting for the moment the illegitimate daughter of Anne Boleyn would falter under the weight of the crown. But beneath the gilded coronation robes, beneath the polished words of her advisers, and the glittering cheers of London's streets, there was something no one could see unless they looked closely. Sorrow. Solitude. The quiet ache of a woman standing alone on a mountain built from the bones of her past. From the first days of her reign, Elizabeth faced a question more relentless than any foreign army. When will you marry? Parliament debated it. The Privy Council pressed it. European princes offered themselves like trophies. Marriage, they said, would secure alliances. Marriage would produce heirs. Marriage would make the kingdom safe. But Elizabeth already knew the truth. Marriage was a cage. A crown placed into someone else's hands. A door left unlocked for ruin. She had watched her mother die for marriage. She had been scarred for life by the hands of Thomas Seymour, who haunted her dreams still. She had seen her sister Mary use marriage to prop up a burning tyranny. Elizabeth's answer to the world was not anger, but a cold, controlled flame. "I have but one mistress and no master." A sentence as sharp as the sword that once ended her mother's life. She would serve England, and no man would ever rule her by ring, by oath, or by force. This was not the declaration of a proud virgin. It was the vow of a survivor. There were men she loved. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, whose friendship was the closest thing Elizabeth had to a soulmate. Philip II of Spain, briefly suggested as a political match, though he had been her sister's husband, Duke Henry of Anjou, who charmed her with French grace. Even the Archduke Charles of Austria, polite and persistent. But each time the council asked, her answer stayed the same. Politics over passion, crown over cradle. She was not immune to longing. But longing had never kept her alive. Only discipline had. At night, beneath her queen's canopy, Elizabeth lit 20 candles in her chamber. Not for beauty, nor reading, nor prayer, but out of fear. Fear that darkness would bring back her mother's execution. Fear that closing her eyes in shadow would take her back to the Tower courtyard, where, at 2 years old in her dream, she could not stop the blade. She kept light near her at all times. She slept lightly. She rose early. She never let the night fully take her. Even as England prospered, even as poets praised her golden reign, her war was not just against Spain or papal bulls. Her war was with the ghost in her blood, that silent terror that whispered, "You are alone. No one will save you." No one ever did. And so she refused to ever stand beneath a man's shadow. She became the shadow, a sovereign cloaked in brilliance and caution, a queen who never let her guard down, even among those she loved, a woman whose greatest loyalty was to her own survival. Crown atop her head, jewels on her throat, gloved hands steady, Elizabeth knew her path was one that no man would walk beside her. She would build a dynasty of the mind, not the womb. She would plant her seed not in a crib, but in the soil of history. She would bear no children, yet give birth to an empire. Every night, as the last candle flickered, Elizabeth stared into the dark corners of her room and whispered the truth only she knew. Power must sleep alone. And in that isolation, she was both invincible and infinitely breakable. When Elizabeth became queen, she made a conscious choice to rule not through terror or brute force, but through strategy, intelligence, and above all, restraint. She remembered the years of her father's reign, the executions without trial, the whispered accusations of treason, the arbitrary cruelty of a king's desire. And she remembered her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed on the 19th of May 1536, without any true proof of guilt. She had watched in memory, if not in body, as a woman was destroyed by politics and rumour. That memory stayed with her sharper than a blade, more enduring than a crown. Elizabeth never issued a public decree to clear her mother's name. She never allowed Parliament to discuss it. She knew that doing so, overturning a royal conviction, challenging the legal foundations of her own legitimacy, would have shaken the fragile foundations of her reign. She was queen, but she ruled in a world shaped by laws, created to destroy the very woman who gave her life. So she honoured Anne Boleyn in the only way she could, through her choices. Elizabeth never executed a single woman on White Tower Green, the very spot where her mother's head had fallen under the sword of a French executioner. Men might be hanged or beheaded for treason, but women, no matter the accusation, would not die on that grass while Elizabeth lived. It was a silent vow. Others saw it as mercy. She knew it was a promise made to the child inside her, the one who had once cried out at the scaffold in vain. She ordered the chapel at the Tower to be restored, and prayers to be said for all souls misjudged by history. No names were spoken, no speeches declared, but everyone who stood beneath that vaulted ceiling knew that the first soul meant was Anne. She could not rewrite the past, but she could shape the present so that others did not suffer the way her mother did. Every pardon, every stay of execution, every measured response was a quiet rebellion against her father's legacy. Still, no amount of justice given to others could fully repair the wound within her. At night, Elizabeth slept in chambers lined with mirrors, so that light would bounce through the room, leaving no shadow large enough for memory to hide in. She refused to let her rooms go dark. More than 20 candles burned every night, even when she was alone. Especially when she was alone. She feared silence. She feared the moment between breaths when darkness pressed in and her mind slipped once more into the same nightmare that had stalked her since girlhood. Her mother kneeling, her child voice screaming, "I command you to stop!" Her cry swallowed by time. She was queen, but she did not sleep like one. Her ladies observed that she never seemed fully at rest. Her eyelids fluttered as if they fought against dreams. Her fingers sometimes curled, as if reaching for a hand she could not grasp. Through the day, she was brilliant, shrewd in council, charismatic in court, decisive with sword and treaty alike. But in the quiet of her chambers, Elizabeth knew that power could not protect her from memory's cruelty. She could command armies, but she could not command her mind to forget. She could silence Parliament, but not the voice inside her, remembering the child who could not save her mother. And so she kept watch. Every night, lit by flickering flames, surrounded by mirrors, always observing, always guarded. Even in her finest victories, in her most celebrated triumphs, Elizabeth remained at her core a child holding her breath in the shadow of a blade. Because in her dreams, the execution never ended, the sword never missed, and her voice was never heard. To the outside world, the reign of Elizabeth I seemed unshakable. England flourished under her rule. Through the day, she was brilliant, shrewd in council, charismatic in court, decisive with sword and treaty alike. But in the quiet of her chambers, Elizabeth knew that power could not protect her from memory's cruelty. She could command armies, but she could not command her mind to forget. She could silence Parliament, but not the voice inside her, remembering the child who could not save her mother. And so she kept watch. Every night, London transformed into a vibrant, glittering capital. The world saw a golden age. But behind the immaculate facade of this golden age, there existed a different kind of war. A quiet war fought not on battlefields, but in the shadows of royal chambers. A war against a mind that never rested. A war fought in sleepless nights and trembling mornings. Elizabeth could not sleep through the night. She never allowed her chambers to go fully dark. 20 candles burned each evening, their flames dancing across mirrored walls, the reflections pushing back darkness as though it were a living enemy. She was not afraid of the night. She was afraid of what waited in it. The dream. The blade. The voice that begged guards to stop. Foreign ambassadors, puzzled yet cautious, reported to their courts. The Queen looks tired, though her smile seems undiminished. They called her radiant, they called her cunning, some even called her immortal. The arts reached heights never before seen. William Shakespeare wrote plays that would outlive centuries. Sir Walter Raleigh claimed new lands across the ocean and named an American colony Virginia in her honor. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe and struck directly at the heart of the Spanish Empire. Under her command, England defeated the Spanish Armada in the year 1588. Trade expanded. Universities thrived, not because she lacked suitors, not because she was cold, but because she knew what marriage meant. For a queen, marriage did not mean safety. It meant surrender. There was one man she might have loved, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. They had known each other since childhood. He was the one she smiled with, the one she trusted almost completely. He danced with her on New Year's feasts. He brought her gifts from his travels. But none knew that every morning, in the brief silence before her ladies entered, Elizabeth closed her eyes and whispered the same thought. I have survived another night. Loneliness settled over her like winter frost. It was a familiar weight, one she had learned to carry as steadily as her crown. Suitors came and she dismissed them. From the French princes of Valois, to the Archduke Charles of Austria, to Philip II of Spain himself, she refused every proposal. She chose solitude, not out of pride, but out of necessity. For though the world called her the Virgin Queen, she was in truth the wounded queen. Every rejection of a wedding ring was not merely political defiance. It was an act of self-preservation, the saving of a heart that had been betrayed too young, too often. Marriage meant trust. It meant being vulnerable. And Elizabeth knew better than anyone. Those who love you may still feed you to the flame. So she smiled, and ruled, and carried the sorrow that no one saw. In courtly portraits, her hand rested on a globe on a kingdom, but never in another's hand. Never again. Because for Elizabeth Tudor, love was not a legacy. It was a lesson written in blood. As the years passed, Elizabeth grew stronger and more exhausted. To hold on to the throne, she had to become something no one taught her to be, the spider at the center of the web, the queen of observation, calculation, and control. Every thread of court politics ran through her hands. Every whisper in Europe was weighed against her safety. She trusted no one completely. She could not afford to. On the surface, she was adored. Crowds cheered her name. Playwrights immortalized her in poetry and verse. She laughed at feasts, danced at court, and offered witty retorts to ambassadors. But beneath the velvet and pearls lay a sharp, relentless vigilance, the constant awareness that one wrong step might lead her to the same fate as her mother. The greatest test of her reign did not come from foreign invasion or palace intrigue, but from her own blood. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth's cousin had long been held under house arrest in England. Mary had a claim to the English throne through their mutual grandmother, Margaret Tudor. To Catholics across Europe, she was the rightful queen, the last heir of the ancient line, unmarred by scandal. To Elizabeth, she was both family and threat. For 18 years, Mary lived as a prisoner and a symbol. She wrote letters to Elizabeth, calling her sister. But she also sent coded messages to conspirators, men who plotted to kill Elizabeth and place Mary on her throne. Again and again, Elizabeth refused to execute her. She knew what it meant to be the daughter of a condemned woman. She knew the terror of being held captive without proof. And yet, the pressure mounted. Every failed plot to assassinate her had Mary's name tied to it. Every time the Catholic world called for Elizabeth's death, they called for Mary's rise. In the year 1586, the Babington plot was exposed, undeniable proof that Mary had sanctioned rebellion and regicide. Elizabeth wept when she read the charges. She could no longer delay the inevitable. On the 1st of February 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. She cried as she held the quill. Her hand shook, the ink smeared. She hesitated not as a queen, but as a woman. To sign meant killing her own cousin. To refuse meant risking her nation. She signed. Mary was executed on the 8th of February. She wore a crimson robe, the colour of martyrdom, and declared she died a Catholic and a queen. Her head was severed in one stroke. In that moment, something in Elizabeth cracked. The queen who had sworn to rule with justice and restraint had taken the life of another queen, another woman born to wear a crown. Mary's blood did not sanctify Elizabeth's reign. It haunted it. The nightmares worsened. Now, when Elizabeth closed her eyes, she saw not one execution but two, her mother in grey, her cousin in red. The blade falling, the silence that followed. The world celebrated Elizabeth's decision. They called her wise, resolute, strong enough to do what was necessary. But Elizabeth herself whispered another truth in the hollow of her own mind. Power is a slow death. I killed her to keep the crown, and a part of me died with her. 45 years she ruled, longer than any monarch before her. No woman had ever held such power in her own right across Europe. But there was a price, an invisible, unending cost. To be the most powerful woman in the world meant she could never pause, never soften, never turn her back to take a breath, not even for 1 second, because she knew better than anyone that the moment a queen stops watching the blade, it falls. Elizabeth's reign would be remembered as one of the most dazzling eras in English history, the age of exploration, poetry, and empire. Under her hand, England defeated the greatest naval force in Europe, fostered an explosion of literature and science, and laid the foundations of what would one day be called the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never sets. Yet beneath this golden legacy, there was a truth that only flickered behind her eyes in the dark. Every triumph was built on the fractured heart of a child who never stopped mourning her mother. When Spain's invincible armada shattered against English fire and storm in the year 1588, the world hailed Elizabeth as a warrior queen. When Shakespeare penned his tragedies and comedies, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, the English people believed they were living in a blessed age, guided by a woman of unmatched wisdom. When explorers named distant lands after her Virginia, after her famed chastity, they adored her as a virgin goddess, a monarch touched by destiny. But when the crowds dispersed, the torches dimmed, and she returned to her private chambers, Elizabeth often sat before a mirror lit by candlelight, not to admire her face, but to study the shadow in her own eyes. She wore pearls stitched into her gowns, woven into her hair, draped around her neck not merely for beauty, but because they held meaning. Henry VIII, before he turned his back, once called her his pearl of the world. Those pearls became her armor, a fragile, gleaming reminder of a father's fleeting love. But beneath that armor, closer to her skin, lay her truest protection, a ring. On her coronation day in 1559, Elizabeth wore a gold ring bearing a tiny secret, a portrait hidden beneath its surface. One side bore her likeness as queen. The other held a miniature painting of her mother, Anne Boleyn. No one knew. Not her ladies, not her counsellors, not her lovers. For 45 years, through war and plague and triumph, she never took it off. It was the only place where her mother lived with her, not in memory, but in metal, a silent promise pressed into flesh. "Mother," she said without words, "I became the queen you died for." And so she ruled, with brilliance, with terror, with love, and with sacrifice. Each time she raised her sceptre, each time she spoke to Parliament, the ghost of Anne stood beside her, unseen but deeply present. But time is relentless even to queens. In the winter of 1603, Elizabeth's strength began to fail. She grew thinner, her face more pale beneath the layers of powder. Yet she refused to lie down. The court begged her to rest. She would not, because she knew if she slept, truly slept, the blade would fall once more in her dreams. She would wake too late to stop it, or not wake at all. For days she stood or sat in silence, staring into the dimming light of her chambers. Her ladies wept. Courtiers whispered. The golden age was dying, and the queen would not close her eyes. When the end finally came, she was seated on cushions, wrapped in layers of jewels and pearls. She slipped into sleep, the deep kind she had denied herself for decades. Her hand relaxed at last. It was only then that her coronation ring could be removed. Physicians tried to lift it gently, but the flesh had swollen around it, as if the ring and the woman were one being. They had to cut it free. And beneath the band, etched lightly into the queen's skin, was the faded imprint of her mother's painted face, like a tender bruise of memory. That ring was not ornamentation, it was revelation. All the power, all the victories, all the history she shaped, were born from the wound of a child who once cried out in her sleep, "Mama, don't go." Elizabeth Tudor knew this truth, the truth that followed her for a lifetime. Sometimes the greatest crowns are forged from the deepest pain, and she wore hers with grace. No matter how many fleets she crushed or nations she defied, Elizabeth I never defeated one enemy, her dreams. Every night, after the feasts ended and the council chambers emptied, after the generals bowed and the ambassadors withdrew, England's triumphant queen returned to a silent, haunted battleground, her own bed. In her private chambers, she insisted on light. Dozens of candles burned throughout the night, the wax melting in long trails like tears down the brass holders. Mirrors placed on every wall multiplied the flickering glow, pushing the shadows back. Elizabeth believed in many things: strategy, diplomacy, destiny. But she did not believe in safety in the dark. She slept lightly, never more than a few hours at a time. She never slept past dawn. Even on mornings when the court describes her as radiant, her ladies knew it was because she forced herself awake before the nightmare could reach its worst point. But most nights, it still reached her. The dream never changed. It never softened. The Tower of London stood in grey silence. The straw beneath her mother's knees rustled with the cold spring wind. Anne Boleyn wore a gown of dove grey, her dark hair tucked into a white coif. Her small, sharp face turned toward the crowd as if searching for someone. Elizabeth was there not as queen but as the child she once was, dressed in white linen, running barefoot across the courtyard. The child screamed, "I am the queen! I command you to stop!" But her voice was thin as rain. No one turned. No guard hesitated. The sword rose. The blade flashed. The head fell. And every time, Elizabeth woke up silent, not screaming, but breathing like she had been run through with an unseen dagger. Her heart pounded painfully against her nightgown. Sweat collected at her temples. She would sit up, stare at the candles still burning, and remind herself, "You are queen. You survived." But the fear never fully retreated. It only curled itself into her bones, whispering of that moment when she had no power, no voice, only grief. She shared this with no one, not her council, not her ladies, not even with Robert Dudley in their closest moments. The world saw a queen who never trembled. But inside, she fought nightly to keep that trembling child asleep. Court physicians noted her persistent exhaustion. Ambassadors sent home letters saying, The Queen seems ever wakeful, ever watchful, as if something hunts her in her sleep. They were not wrong. No enemy, not Spain nor Rome nor Scotland, ever frightened Elizabeth as deeply as the memory behind her eyelids. For more than 50 years, she carried that little girl inside her. The child who cried, the child who reached out, the child whose command meant nothing. A queen was built around that wound, wrapped in jewels, draped in ermine, but never truly healed. Her courtiers puzzled over her habits. Why she rose before dawn even when ill. Why she avoided sleeping in darkness. Why she kept a book by her bed at all times, sometimes reading aloud in Latin to no one at 3 a.m. They never understood that these were not quirks, they were reinforcements. A fortress built brick by brick against an enemy with no face, no name, only a memory. Even in triumph, in festivals and processions, in paintings and sonnets praising her as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, her eyes held a depth not taught by tutors or poets. They held the perpetual sorrow of a woman who had never been able to save the person she loved most. History tells us Elizabeth ruled with unmatched brilliance. But history often forgets that inside that brilliant ruler was a 2-year-old girl in a grey courtyard, staring up at a falling sword. And no one, not Parliament, not lovers, not poets, ever came to save her. She had to save herself. Every night, every morning, for as long as she wore the crown. Beneath the velvet, beneath the pearls, beneath the layers of gold-threaded silk that marked her as queen, Elizabeth carried a secret. It glimmered on her finger, a coronation ring made of gold and ruby, crafted in the year 1559 for her ascension to the throne. Each time she raised her hand to command silence in court. Each time she pressed her signet into wax to seal a royal decree, the ring shone in the candlelight, a symbol of power, legitimacy, authority. But the truth was buried beneath that power, embedded in the metal itself. For 45 years of reign, no one knew that the underside of the ring held a miniature portrait. Not of Edward, her brother, not of Henry, her father, not of any saint or heraldic emblem, but of her mother, Anne Boleyn. So small that it could only be seen when held close to the eye. So carefully done that it must have been commissioned in absolute secret. It showed Anne's face as it had been in youth. High cheekbones, dark eyes, a slight, knowing curve to her lips. The face of a woman whom the kingdom had condemned and whom history would attempt to erase. Elizabeth never removed that ring. Not once. She wore it through wars, through famines, through plague and rebellion. She wore it when she stood at Tilbury in armour before her troops. She wore it when she sentenced Mary, Queen of Scots, to death. She wore it when she pardoned poets, and laughed at fools, and spoke in Latin before Parliament. The world saw a queen whose hand did not tremble. They did not see that the hand held her mother's image pressed into her flesh all her waking days. She could not clear her mother's name on royal record. Too dangerous. Too destabilizing. To do so would mean admitting her father, Henry VIII, had committed murder, not justice. A queen could be bold, but not foolish, and Elizabeth was never foolish. Instead, she cleared her mother's name in the only way she could, by ruling better than any king before her. Every strategic move, every display of restraint in matters of bloodshed, every calculated gesture of mercy, it all sprang from one enduring truth. Elizabeth never forgot what happened to the woman who loved her before she even spoke. Anne Boleyn had been declared a traitor, a witch, an adulteress. She had died alone, abandoned by her husband, accused without proof, and Elizabeth had watched in dreams, in whispered memories, and learned. She learned that the world punishes bold women. She learned that power without protection is fatal. She learned that love does not guarantee safety. But she also learned something else. You can build an empire from pain if you refuse to let it crush you. Elizabeth built that empire in her mother's honour, not in name but in spirit. She created a church that answered to the English throne, not to Rome. She fostered scholars, playwrights, scientists. She kept peace in her court for decades without marrying. She won war after war without losing her crown. She outlived every enemy who ever called her illegitimate. She did all this with a portrait pressed to her skin, beneath a crown and behind an iron mind. Not Henry, not the Vatican, not Parliament, none of them made her kingly. What made her queen untouchable, incomparable, was a girl's quiet vow. I will not die like my mother. I will rule in a way that saves others from her fate. I will prove she deserved better. And so, beneath her robes and jewels, beneath her public stoicism and unshakable command, lay a single truth. Every moment of her reign was a conversation with a ghost. The ghost of a woman wronged, a mother robbed of everything except her daughter's devotion. A daughter who ruled better than any king in history because every night she slept with her mother's face close to her heart. On the day Elizabeth died, the 24th of March, 1603, the doctors found they could not remove the coronation ring easily. Her flesh had grown around it. They were forced to cut it from her hand. And beneath the gold, they found Anne's face, faded with time but still there. That was no jewel. It was a vow. By the end of the 16th century, the Golden Queen of England began to fade. It was not sudden nor dramatic, just an erosion, like stone worn by centuries of rain. Elizabeth's body, once sustained by sheer will, began to betray her. Sleep, already a fragile stranger, became impossible. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she seldom lay down at all. Instead, she stood or sat through the night, stiff-backed in her gown, her eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. Her Privy Council watched her decline with growing alarm. They urged her gently, then urgently. "Your Majesty must rest. Your Majesty must sleep." But Elizabeth only shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips, tired, brittle as old parchment. "If I lie down," she replied, "I know I shall not rise again." For she feared not death itself, but the dream that would greet her if she surrendered to sleep, the familiar execution ground, the familiar blade. She had made war with her nightmares for more than 45 years. By now there was no distinction between mind and memory, between the Queen and the child who still screamed in her sleep. The shadow of Anne Boleyn followed her everywhere. The crown was heavy, yes, but the past was heavier. Her fear became ritual. Every candle must be lit. Every corner of the room must be visible. She allowed no darkness, not even in winter. Her chambermaids whispered that the Queen had become a phantom of herself, walking, pacing, wrapped in layers of pearl-embroidered cloth like armor. She wore robes so heavy with jewels that younger women could not lift them. She sewed more than 100 pearls onto each gown, as if surrounding herself with their cold glow might remind her of the father who once called her the pearl of the world. She was 67 years old, and still fighting for the approval of a dead parent. Foreign ambassadors, trained to observe and report every detail, wrote dispatches home. "The Queen is beautiful, though pale as marble and thin as a blade. She seems both immortal and haunted." They noted her grace, her brilliance in council, and her growing stillness. She laughed less, smiled less. In the silence between state audiences, her lips moved with no sound, as if reciting an old script, or speaking to someone no one else could see. And though the world around her still bowed and cheered, Elizabeth felt the layers beneath the applause. When she looked into the mirror, and she stood before mirrors often, under flickering candlelight she no longer saw Gloriana, the queen of a reborn empire. She saw Anne Boleyn's cheekbones, Anne's eyes, Anne's fate. Her heart whispered, across decades of loss, "Mother, I have done all I could. I have ruled longer than any king. I have built the world you never got to see. So why does it still hurt? Perhaps nothing would ever be enough. Even an empire could not mend what was broken at 2 years old." So Elizabeth pressed forward one day at a time, too tired to live, too afraid to sleep. The world saw a queen clothed in jewels, but inside there was only a quiet child reaching upward with empty hands, asking a question no crown could answer. A question whispered between heartbeats in every sleepless night. "Mother, are you proud of me?" In March of the year 1603, at Richmond Palace, the greatest monarch England had ever known faced her final dawn. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of a disgraced queen and a ruthless king, lay motionless on a lavish stack of embroidered cushions. By her own command, she refused to be placed in a bed. A queen, she had once said, must not surrender her throne lying down. She would be seated, upright, dignified as she had lived. But now, even her will had limits. Her gown shimmered with hundreds of pearls, stitched into every fold like frozen tears. Her body, frail and thin beneath the weight of the jewels, sagged toward the earth. Courtiers watched in reverent silence. No one dared speak. Even her most trusted ladies-in-waiting did nothing but stand guard, holding vigil as though they too were afraid of sleep. For days, Elizabeth had spoken little and slept less. Her eyes wandered rooms, corners, distant walls. It seemed as if she were tracking something invisible, or listening for footsteps no one else could hear. She had once commanded armies. Now she sat in silence, fighting the battle only she could see. And yet in those last moments something changed. Near dawn, when the candles had burned dangerously low, Elizabeth smiled. A small, quiet smile. Gentle, astonishing in its peace. One lady said she looked almost childlike, as if the decades had slipped away and left behind not a queen, but a girl of 2, reaching up with hopeful hands. Her breathing slowed. She leaned back, just slightly, as though resting her head on unseen arms. Her eyes fluttered. Then, for the first time in more than 40 years, her face was free of fear. Some said her lips moved, too soft to hear. Those closest insisted she whispered something, words meant for someone who was not in the room. Others claimed she looked upward, not at the stone ceiling overhead, but through it as if seeing sky, or a familiar figure descending from it. Elizabeth died at sunrise. Her final breath left her as the first light entered the room, a thin, quiet ribbon of gold across the Queen's silk and pearls. One of her ladies swore she heard Elizabeth murmur, "I've finished, Mother." Others claimed she asked, "Will you be proud of me?" No one answered in that silent chamber. The courtiers bowed their heads. The councillors wept. The crown of England passed to a new king. But many believed, or needed to believe, that someone did answer her. That in the quiet between heartbeats, at the edge of waking and dreaming, Anne Boleyn finally appeared. Not kneeling, not condemned, but whole, smiling, holding out her arms. And in that vision, there was no sword, no straff, no scream, only a mother saying at last to the child who had survived everything, "Yes, my Elizabeth, I'm proud. A queen died that morning, but a daughter was finally held. Elizabeth I, a name history will never forget. She was the child abandoned by a king, the girl called bastard by her own nation, and yet she rose to become the most powerful woman in Europe. Her reign, stretching 44 years and 127 days, reshaped a kingdom and ignited an era, the English Golden Age. She defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. She became the sovereign who nurtured playwrights like Shakespeare, explorers like Drake and Raleigh, and thinkers who dared to question the world. She turned a land of religious strife into a nation of rising power. But in truth, Elizabeth's greatest victory was not over armies or empires, it was over her own pain. Her entire life, she carried a wound no eye could see. A wound that began on a scaffold in the Tower of London when she was only 2 years old. History applauded her strength, her brilliance, her relentless control. But behind every command, every calculated gesture, was the silent scream of a child who once begged for her mother to live. And that child never left her. She learned to mask that cry in ceremony. She buried it under pearls and music and power. But she never erased it. She knew with brutal clarity that her reign was built not on a legacy of love, but on the ashes of betrayal. She governed not to prove her lineage, but to prove that the girl nobody wanted could change the world. When Elizabeth died, she chose to be interred in Westminster Abbey, the resting place of kings. But it was not Henry VIII she wished to lie beside. No scream, only a mother saying at last to the child who had survived everything, "Yes, my Elizabeth, I'm proud. A queen died that morning, but a daughter was finally held. Elizabeth I, a name history will never forget. She was the child abandoned by a king, the girl called bastard by her own nation, and yet she rose to become the most powerful woman in Europe. Because beneath that stone, beside that sister, Elizabeth carried someone else too, a mother's memory, a child's heart. When the physicians removed her coronation ring, they found Anne Boleyn's portrait pressed against the Queen's skin, as if it had been kissing her hand for every year she reigned. Only then did the world understand. Elizabeth did not escape her past. She carried it, and she transformed it. Instead, she made her final rest, next to her half-sister Mary Tudor, the woman who once sent her to the Tower, who once made her fear the block, just as Anne had. Yet Elizabeth chose peace in death. even where there had been conflict in life. On their shared tombstone, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here lie two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary." The words are true but incomplete. In the end, a crown rested where a child's head once bowed in grief. The little girl, standing powerless in the Tower yard, rose at last to lift a nation. There are wounds that never heal. There are stories that never fade. But some hearts, even shattered ones, learn to wear their scars like armor. And that is how Elizabeth Tudor won her final war.